The Moscow sky was a metallic gray when the presidential plane from Burkina Faso began its descent toward Vnukovo International Airport. Through the window, Ibrahim Traoré observed the low clouds enveloping the Russian capital, like an omen of the diplomatic climate, awaiting the young 34-year-old leader. This former captain, who became president after a coup d'etat, embodied a new generation of African leaders determined to rewrite the rules of the geopolitical game. The plane finally touched the runway with a slight jolt. Through the window, Traoré caught sight of the imposing reception area. A row of black limousines, Russian officials in ceremonial uniforms, and a military detachment lined up. "With mechanical precision, Mr. President, we have arrived," announced his aide-de-camp Commander Ued. Traoré, an imposing figure, kept his face impassive, but deep inside he felt the weight of this meeting for Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation grappling with a jihadist insurgency. This visit was far more than a mere diplomatic formality. The plane's door opened, letting in a gust of icy air. Traoré descended the steps with confident strides. Back straight, gaze fixed, he was immediately struck by the wintry temperature, so different from the Sahelian heat of Ouagadougou. A Russian officer stepped forward, extending his hand to President Traoré. "Welcome to the Russian Federation. I am General Alexei Petrov, representative of the Ministry of Defense." Traoré shook the offered hand, immediately noting the coldness of the gesture, not only from the Moscow climate, but also a certain distance in the officer's gaze, a barely concealed tension. "Thank you for this reception, General," he replied in French, his interpreter translating instantly. General Petrov gave a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "President Putin is eager to meet you. Your political ascent has been followed with great interest here." Moscow. The emphasis on ascent did not escape Traoré, a veiled reference to the coup that had brought him to power. As they headed toward the presidential limousine, Traoré noticed the protocol seemed curiously minimal, with no red carpet rolled out, no isolated journalists. Only a few official photographers clicked frantically. When he entered the car, he noticed the flags. The Russian flag flew proudly on the hood, but the Burkina Faso flag seemed to have been added hastily, positioned slightly lower. The procession left the airport perimeter. Through the tinted window, Traoré observed Moscow. Wide avenues, imposing buildings, remnants of the Soviet era, mixed with the ostentatious modernity of new districts. His first visit to Moscow. General Petrov, seated beside him, confirmed that Traoré has studied me thoroughly. Then he added, "The history of your country. What have you truly learned from that history?" He maintained eye contact, an expression suggesting the Russians would not tolerate being dominated by anyone. A silence settled, as thick as the winter mist enveloping the city. "I hope you understand what it means to be here," Petrov finally said, his tone laced with a subtle threat. The limousine slowed. Ahead, a barrier of uniformed police blocked the avenue. Traoré asked the convoy to stop. "What's going on?" he inquired, intrigued by this unexpected interruption. General Petrov consulted his phone, visibly annoyed. A simple security check, an insignificant detail. But time passed and the procession remained stationary. The 5-minute halt, then 10 minutes of silence in the limousine, felt oppressive. Traoré leaned toward Idraogo, whispering in their native language, a hint of concern in his voice. "Something's wrong." Simultaneously, voices rose outside. Shouts, slogans. Traoré lowered the window, despite the disapproving glance from the Russian general. A group of young Africans had gathered on the sidewalk, waving Burkina Faso flags. "Traoré! Traoré!" they chanted fervently, trying to approach the vehicle. The Russians formed a cordon, holding them back with visible firmness without hesitation. Traoré opened the door. "Mr. President, I advise against this," said Petrov, but Traoré was already outside, heading toward the crowd. Burkinabe and Russian bodyguards immediately surrounded him, creating an improvised security perimeter. "Let me speak with them," he ordered. A young man approached. "Mr. President Traoré, we are Burkinabe students in Moscow. They're trying to stop us from greeting you, saying we don't have authorization." Traoré's gaze hardened instantly. "These people are my compatriots. They have the right to speak to me." The disoriented Russian officer looked to General Petrov, who had just stepped out of the limousine. Petrov insisted the schedule was tight. Ultimately, security was the priority, he said, but Traoré didn't budge. "The voice of my people is my priority," he declared. He approached, shaking the student's hands. listening to their grievances, deliberately ignoring the growing unease of the Russian authorities. A policeman tried to push back a student. With particular determination, Traoré firmly placed his hand on the officer's arm. "No one will push my people," he said in a calm but resolute voice. General Petrov stepped forward, tension visible on his face. He leaned toward Traoré and whispered, "You are not in Burkina Faso, Mr. President." Their eyes locked in a brief moment that revealed the true nature of this visit. It would not be a mere diplomatic meeting, but a clash between two worldviews. The Kremlin loomed ahead. The majestic and solemn Ibrahim Traoré ascended the steps of the Grand Palace, escorted by a detachment of impassive Russian honor guards. The corridors seemed endless, adorned with gold and paintings depicting the great moments of Russian history. Each step echoed on the polished marble, marking the approach of this long-awaited meeting. In the antechamber of the reception room, Traoré adjusted his military uniform. He had deliberately chosen his military attire over a civilian suit, a silent reminder of his journey and his country's situation. "President Putin will arrive shortly," announced an aide. A Russian diplomat, whose piercing gaze Traoré hadn't missed, reminded him that the meeting was limited to 45 minutes. Traoré had noticed since his arrival furtive glances and whispers, as if his presence represented an unexpected anomaly in the Kremlin's well-oiled protocol. The double doors finally opened, revealing a vast reception hall. Vladimir Putin, at the center, advanced with measured steps, surrounded by advisors and bodyguards. Slightly behind was an imposing man Traoré immediately recognized as General Vladimirov, head of Russian military operations in Africa. President Putin extended his hand, displaying that enigmatic smile that had become his trademark on the international stage. "Welcome to Moscow." The handshake was firm, almost painful, a thinly veiled test of will. Traoré matched the pressure with equal intensity. The Kremlin master's gaze never left the president's. "Thank you for the reception, President Putin," he replied, as photographers' flashes crackled around them, immortalizing this first encounter. The two men sat in armchairs adorned with the Russian double-headed eagle, a small table between them, holding tea and traditional pastries that no one would touch. "Did your journey go well?" asked Putin as an opener, his interpreter translating simultaneously. "Without incident," Traoré replied, deliberately referencing the student episode. A faint smile appeared on Putin's lips. "We are aware of the spontaneous demonstration upon your arrival. Our service's anticipation of your compatriots' enthusiasm was not an excuse, but a way to establish that nothing escapes our vigilance. The Burkinabe people are passionate," Traoré responded simply, even far from their homeland, his eyes betraying no emotion. "Passion is a force when properly channeled." He paused deliberately as the power of the message was barely veiled. Traoré sensed that every word in this conversation had been carefully weighed, each sentence carrying a double meaning. "Let us now address the purpose of your visit," Putin continued, abruptly dispensing with usual courtesies. "You seek greater military support from Russia." The bluntness of the question might have unsettled a less experienced diplomat, but Traoré had survived far more than verbal boldness. "I hope to establish a relationship based on mutual respect and partnership," he replied calmly, without subservience. General Vladimirov, silent until then, couldn't suppress a look of surprise mixed with irritation. He exchanged a glance with Putin, who maintained his legendary impassivity. "Russia respects the sovereignty of its partners, unlike certain Western powers," Putin asserted. "But a partnership implies shared interests and mutual benefits. Precisely, Burkina Faso possesses considerable manganese and zinc resources. We seek partners who look beyond extraction and commit to business development." "The Russians are ready to invest," Putin replied, "but first require a guarantee of stability." Stability echoed in the room like a veiled critique, a barely disguised reference to the two successive coups Burkina Faso had experienced. "True stability cannot be imported." Traoré's response had to come from within, from the people's trust in their leaders. Putin studied him for a long moment. "You speak like a revolutionary president." Traoré replied, "I speak as someone who has sworn to protect his country from all forms of violence and interference." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. The advisors present seemed to hold their breath, aware that this exchange transcended the usual diplomatic framework. The door opened, admitting a group, primarily Russian journalists, but also a few international media representatives. President Putin intervened, asking a journalist, "How would you define the relationship between Russia and Burkina Faso at this moment?" Putin smiled instantly, resuming his public mask. "A promising relationship, based on principles of pragmatic cooperation, as long as it continues to benefit both our nations." The subtle conditionality of his response did not escape Traoré. "A useful relationship must benefit both parties," Traoré replied calmly. "Africa has served others' interests and ended up exhausted." A murmur rippled through the assembly. Putin paused, his eyes fixed on the young African president with renewed intensity. "I hope you understand." "Well, where is Mr. President Traoré?" he finally asked, his soft voice contrasting with the firmness of his gaze. Traoré met his eyes, resolute. "I know exactly where I am and who I am." As if time had stopped in the vast hall, the journalists, sensing the electricity in the air, doubled their attention at that moment. General Vladimirov leaned toward Putin, whispering something only the Russian president could hear, but his glance toward Traoré suggested that this young man was bolder than they had thought. Putin rose abruptly, signaling, "At the end of this public part of the meeting, our handshake will be as firm as ever, but our gaze will have evolved. It will no longer be just mistrust, but a reassessment. We will continue this conversation during the state lunch," he announced, "and tomorrow you will be my guest of honor at the military parade on Red Square." Traoré and Aka, aware that this invitation was not merely a courteous protocol, but also a demonstration of strength, a reminder of Russian military might, left the hall side by side. The atmosphere was heavy with unresolved tensions, concealed behind polite formulas and diplomatic smiles. The reality of a confrontation just beginning hovered above. The Moscow sky had cleared, offering a cold blue over the palace, contrasting with the Kremlin's ochre. The historic center of Red Square, a symbol of Russian power, was transformed into a martial theater for the occasion. Thousands of soldiers in ceremonial uniforms stood motionless like statues, awaiting the order to begin the parade. Ibrahim Traoré was on the official platform, observing the spectacle with calculated attention. Beside him, Vladimir Putin, dressed in a long black coat, maintained that impenetrable expression that had made his reputation. The silence was almost palpable, charged with the previous day's tensions. "Impressive, isn't it?" Putin commented, finally breaking the protocol silence. The Russian military tradition dates back centuries. Any country defending its sovereignty must have a force capable of protecting it. And that is precisely what Burkina Faso, facing Putin's probing, responds to its demands. "We are seeking ways to defend our people. Yes, but not only through arms." A faint smile appeared on Putin's lips. "Ideals are admirable, President Traoré, but in this world, only strength ensures respect." The first notes. The Russian anthem resonated, majestic and solemn. The parade began with perfectly aligned ranks. Lines of soldiers advanced toward the command post, their boots striking the pavement in perfect synchronization, followed by armored vehicles, then tanks, their tracks resounding on the historic square. Traoré listened to Russian dignitaries proudly describing each unit and piece of equipment. General Vladimirov, in particular, seemed to take almost childlike pleasure in this display of power. "Our new anti-aircraft defense systems," he explained to an Asian minister, "can neutralize any aerial threat at any altitude." The implicit message was not subtle. This is what Russia could offer its allies or oppose its adversaries. Suddenly, fighter jets tore through the Moscow sky, trailing the colors of the Russian flag. The crowd gathered around the square applauded enthusiastically, but Traoré noticed something else. His gaze fixed on a group of people in the public section of the square. African faces amid the predominantly Slavic crowd. Putin followed the direction of his gaze. "Your compatriots are numerous in Moscow. Students, mostly." As Traoré prepared to respond, a movement caught his attention. A young woman with slightly dark skin unfurled a small Burkina Faso banner. She began to sing softly at first, then with growing confidence the Burkinabe national anthem. This revolutionary anthem celebrated freedom won against colonial oppression. The green contrasted strangely with the rigor of the Russian military parade. Immediately, security guards turned toward the source of this disturbance. Two men in black uniforms quickly approached the young woman. Traoré straightened abruptly, alert. But before he could react, other voices rose from the crowd. First one, then two, then 10 other Burkinabe in the audience joined the singing, creating a dissonant musical island amid the military parade. A small, improvised demonstration that contrasted with the palpable tension on Putin's face. Your compatriots seem as passionate as you mentioned. General Vladimirov, approaching, exchanged a glance with Putin. The latter nodded slightly, and the general discreetly pulled out his phone. Traoré didn't need to understand Russian to grasp what was happening. The guards were about to intervene, likely to arrest these youths for disturbing the peace. Without hesitation, he leaned toward Putin. If his men touched a single one of their students, it would become an international diplomatic incident. Putin slowly turned his head toward him, his smile still in place, but his eyes as cold as Siberian ice. "Do you think you can threaten me, President Traoré?" "I haven't threatened," Traoré replied calmly. "I've simply warned that their intervention was barely audible to the other dignitaries, but the intensity of their confrontation was palpable. Two wills in silent conflict, as the Burkinabe singing continued to rise, strangely blending with the military anthem. Putin looked at Traoré for a long moment, as if facing a leader daring to challenge him on his own turf. Then, without a word, he made an almost imperceptible gesture to General Vladimirov. The latter, visibly irritated, muttered a few words into his phone. Almost immediately, the guards approaching the singers slowed their advance, then stopped, contenting themselves with maintaining a security cordon around the group. The singing grew louder, carried by about 20 voices. It was not a violent protest, not a serious disturbance, but an assertion of identity. "Your students have courage," Putin finally admitted, "but courage without wisdom can lead to dangerous dead ends." Traoré didn't respond. "My people have learned that silence in the face of force leads only to enslavement." A spark flashed in Putin's eyes. Anger or respect, impossible to tell. But for the first time since Traoré's visit began, it felt as though the Russian president regarded him not as a young, inexperienced head of state, but as a worthy opponent. The rest of the parade continued in tense silence between the two leaders. The tanks, ballistic missiles, and elite units continued their impeccable procession, but Traoré's attention remained split between the military spectacle and the group of African students who had stopped singing, but kept their banner prominently displayed. At the ceremony's end, as the dignitaries prepared to leave the platform, Putin cast one last glance at Traoré. "We have a reception at the Kremlin tonight," he said. "I hope you'll enjoy Russian cuisine." "I always enjoy discovering new flavors," Traoré replied, "provided it's not for the two men parted, each escorted by their delegation. But everyone who witnessed the scene knew an invisible line had been crossed. What had begun as a simple diplomatic visit had turned into a duel of wills with potentially long-term implications. The Kremlin's corridors resembled a maze of marble and gold, each turn revealing another testament to Russian imperial grandeur. Ibrahim Traoré was led to a small waiting room decorated with tapestries depicting Russia's great military victories, a choice that was certainly not coincidental. With his reduced delegation, he reviewed notes prepared for the upcoming economic discussions scheduled for the afternoon. Commander Araugo, meanwhile, stood by the window, observing the inner courtyard where guards performed their duties with mechanical precision. "He's trying to intimidate us," Ouedraogo murmured. "Every painting, every statue here is a message." Traoré looked up from his documents. "Intimidation only works if you accept fear." The door suddenly opened without the guard announcing a visitor. General Vladimirov, his face tense, burst into the room, abandoning all pretense of diplomatic courtesy. Traoré rose slowly, maintaining deliberate calm. "I apologize, General, but don't delude yourself." The general took a step forward, his tall stature dominating the room. "That orchestrated demonstration during the parade, you humiliated Russia in front of the whole world." Ouedraogo stepped forward, but Traoré restrained him with a discreet gesture. This was not the time to escalate tensions. "I orchestrated no demonstration," he replied calmly. "The Burkinabe students expressed their national pride. What does that represent? Humiliation for great Russia." The subtle sarcasm in his voice made Vladimirov's face flush. "You're playing a dangerous game, Traoré. Do you think you can come here and dictate your terms?" "I came seeking partnership, not submission," Traoré replied, still calm. "I simply showed that my people's dignity is non-negotiable." Vladimirov laughed, a short, humorless laugh. Dignity or insolence? He stepped closer until his face was inches from Traoré's. Do you think you're different from the other African leaders who parade through here? Do you think your revolutionary rhetoric impresses the Kremlin? Despite the general's intimidating proximity, Traoré didn't flinch. General insolence is thinking you can still control a people who have chosen freedom. The officers behind Vladimirov exchanged nervous glances. The confrontation had surpassed protocol boundaries, entering diplomatically dangerous territory. Freedom, Vladimirov repeated with contempt. You came to power through a military coup. What freedom have you brought exactly? Traoré smiled faintly. I understand your confusion. In general, the difference between a coup serving foreign interests and a popular revolution can be subtle. For some, General Vladimirov raised his hand, his face contorted with anger, a gesture that, in other contexts, might have preceded an assault. Ouedraogo stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Traoré didn't waver, his eyes locked on the Russian generals. Vladimir Putin's voice thundered through the room. The Russian president stood at the door, his face impassive, but his gaze fixed on General Vladimirov. This is not how we treat our guests, he declared in a measured voice that contrasted with the ambient tension. We are in the presence of heads of state, not children in a playground. Vladimirov immediately straightened, his face shifting from anger to forced deference toward President Putin. I was merely trying to clarify some misunderstandings regarding the Red Square incident, he explained. I'm sure, Putin replied, leaving no room for rebuttal. But you've done enough for today. The general attempted to argue, Mr. President, our position in Africa. He stopped, cut off by Putin. Each syllable fell like a stone in a pond. Vladimirov bowed, casting one last bitter glance at Traoré before leaving the room, followed by his officers. Putin's guards closed the door behind them and turned to the Burkinabe president. A heavy silence settled for a few moments. Then, unexpectedly, the Kremlin master gave a smile that for the first time seemed almost genuine. Please accept my apologies for this diplomatic lapse. President Traoré, the general, is an excellent military strategist, but sometimes his methods lack finesse. Traoré merely shrugged, aware that behind this apparent courtesy lay a far more complex game. I understand patriotic passion, he replied. It exists in every country. Putin approached the window, observed the courtyard for a moment, then continued. You know, there's something I admire in you, Mr. President Traoré. Truly. He asked Traoré to remain vigilant. Courage, Putin confirmed, turning back to him. Few leaders dare to defend their convictions with such boldness. Frankness in these halls. Most prefer meaningless diplomatic formulas. Burkina Faso cannot afford empty diplomacy, Traoré retorted. Our people face existential challenges. Terrorism, poverty, foreign interference. Frankness becomes a necessity. That's precisely why Russia may be a more suitable partner for our situation than Western powers that impose values not ours. We respect local realities with the utmost respect, Mr. President Putin, Traoré replied. True respect implies equality. I didn't come seeking a new master to replace the old ones. Another silence settled, but different this time. It was as if the two men were evaluating each other beyond official masks and diplomatic postures. I admire your courage, Putin repeated, but understand that courage comes at a price, Mr. President Traoré. Freedom always has a price. The Burkinabe leader responded calmly, but it's worth every sacrifice. Putin, with an indecipherable glint in his eyes, replied, We'll see if your people share that conviction when the time comes to pay that price. He headed toward the door, then paused at the threshold. The joint press conference will take place in an hour, despite our differences in perspective. I hope we can present a united front before the international press. Transparency doesn't preclude courtesy. As soon as Putin left the room, Ouedraogo addressed his president. Sir, you're playing with fire, Mr. President. Traoré looked at the door through which the Russian leader had exited. Fire can destroy, Commander, but it can also forge. It depends on who controls the flame. The conference room spotlights illuminated the two presidents seated side by side before a forest of microphones. Behind them, the Russian and Burkinabe flags framed a large banner proclaiming Russo-African cooperation in Cyrillic and French characters. Ibrahim Traoré, in an impeccable military uniform, contrasted with Vladimir Putin. In their tailored, dark, elegant suits, the two leaders, despite their obvious differences, displayed a facade of professional cordiality. Measured smiles, complicit glances, and calculated proximity for the world's cameras. "Gentlemen presidents," began a Reuters journalist, "observers have noted some tensions during your meeting. Mr. President, could you clarify the nature of your discussions?" Putin spoke first. His impassive face revealed no particular emotion. "There are sincere debates between Russia and Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso shares a common vision of a multipolar world where each nation can determine its own destiny without external interference," he explained, adding after a calculated pause, "Our exchanges have been frank and productive, as befits respected partners." The ball was now in Traoré's court, the cameras focused on him, capturing every nuance of his expression and the genuine friendship that complemented it. "Respecting each person's dignity, our discussions were truly frank. It's the only way to establish an equitable partnership," he affirmed. A murmur ran through the journalists' assembly. This diplomatically worded response couldn't mask the tensions that had marked this visit, noted a Financial Times journalist. What agreements were reached during this meeting? Putin signaled to an aide, who produced a red-bound document from a leather briefcase and handed it to Traoré. "We signed several cooperation agreements today," the Russian president declared. These included technical military assistance to address security challenges in the Sahel, partnerships in mining, particularly for mineral extraction, and an enhanced university exchange program. He turned to Traoré with an almost imperceptible smile, and as a symbol of enduring friendship between our nations declared, "I am pleased to present President Traoré with the Order of Friendship Medal, one of the Russian Federation's highest distinctions." This unexpected gesture triggered a flurry of flashes among the photographers present. Putin, holding the medal on a red velvet cushion, stood. Traoré did the same. Aware of the political weight of this moment, accepting the medal was symbolically heavy, a gesture that would be interpreted as alignment with Moscow. Refusing it would have been an impossible diplomatic affront. Putin pinned the medal on Traoré's chest amid controlled applause from the audience. Their eyes met for a moment, and all could read what words didn't say. This decoration was both an honor and a subtle trap. "I thank President Putin," Traoré declared, accepting the medal, turning to the cameras. "This medal belongs to the Burkinabe people, who never resign themselves to silence in the face of adversity." The finesse of this response, which transformed what could have been perceived as submission into an assertion of independence, didn't go unnoticed by the room's astute observers. A Russian aide approached Putin and whispered something in his ear. The president gestured toward the back of the room. The doors opened. To everyone's surprise, the young woman who had sung the Burkinabe anthem on Red Square was escorted to the front of the room. Her face reflected a mix of nervousness and contained pride. "Miss Aida Iwedra Ogo," announced Putin, a student of international relations at Moscow State University, a remarkable voice as we all saw today. A light laugh rippled through the assembly, momentarily easing the tension. Traoré stepped toward the young woman, a sincere smile lighting his face for the first time since arriving in Moscow. He embraced her in a paternal gesture that contrasted the event's formal protocol. "You were the voice of an entire nation," he said loud enough for the front rows of journalists to hear. Putin approached, his calculated expression blending benevolence and authority, the very image of a magnanimous leader. "Your gesture was courageous and bold," he said to Aida. "But remember, one must always exercise caution when raising one's voice." A veiled threat, disguised as paternal advice, was barely concealed. Traoré, standing beside them, responded, "When the voice is authentic, President Putin, there is no wrong place to make it heard." Their eyes met one last time. Two worldviews, two conceptions of power, two generations of leaders sizing each other up. The cameras immortalized this moment. The young captain turned president, the veteran KGB Kremlin leader, and between them, the student who dared to sing her country's anthem on Red Square. An image worth more than all the official communiques. The press conference was drawing to a close. The two presidents exchanged one final handshake before the world's cameras. "I hope your return flight will be pleasant," Putin said to Traoré, with that icy politeness that was his trademark. "I will report to the Burkinabe people the essence of our meeting," Traoré replied, adding that respect is not something to be requested, but something that imposes itself. "You are an interesting man, Ibrahim Traoré. I will follow your career closely and observe Russia's actions in Africa with equal attention," the young president responded calmly. as he left the room side by side, followed by his delegation. An African journalist posed one last question. Does this visit mark a turning point in Russo-African relations? Neither Putin nor Traoré turned to answer, but for everyone present at this unusual meeting, the answer was clear. Something had changed, not so much in official geopolitical alliances, but in the very dynamics of relations between Russia and this new generation of African leaders determined to rewrite the rules of the international game. On the plane returning to Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré gazed out the window at the vast Russian expanses receding below. The Order of Friendship medal was carefully stored in his diplomatic briefcase, an ambivalent symbol of a visit that had been anything but courteous. President Traoré then turned to Commander Iwedra Hogo for his assessment of the visit's outcomes. Traoré remained silent for a moment, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. Then a faint smile curved his lips. "We came seeking arms and agreements," he finally replied, "but we gained something more precious." "And what is that?" "Respect," he said. "Simply respect. It's not the strength of arms, but the strength of convictions." The plane continued its journey toward Africa, leaving behind a Moscow that, for the first time in a long while, wasn't talking about the Kremlin's diplomatic maneuvers or efforts, but about the bold discretion of a young African president who dared to challenge the formidable Vladimir Putin.